this pawn in shape and plays the move d4. Viktor Gazik instantly responds with knight to f6. And now Magnus pushes his pawn to c4. And we have pawn to e6 played here. You can play knight c3 now, which leads to the Nimzo Indian, but Magnus goes knight f3 and we have the Bogo Indian with bishop b4. Now we saw Gukesh in the previous round playing knight d2, but bishop d2 is the main move. Let's see what Magnus chooses here, because both the moves are quite good, and Magnus also plays knight d2. Very interesting. d5 was what Adam Kozak had played against Gukesh. Let's see what Viktor Gazik comes up with here. He goes for the b6 line to put the bishop here, castle, knight e4 and so on. That's how typically you play in these positions. I think a logical thing to do now is to ask the question to the bishop, and it is attacked. If you go back, it would allow white to expand with e4, and so bishop takes d2 has been played, and now queen d2 and bishop d2 were played quite a lot, like bishop d2 with the idea of bg5, or queen d2, later e3, bishop e2 and getting the bishop out on b2. But you can see how Magnus takes his time on this move, because there's another recapture possible and he plays it. Knight takes d2. Interesting. There have been 130 games with this move in the past, and one of the players who's played it is Jordan Van Forest, who has been Magnus's second. Bishop b7 played by Viktor after 7 minutes of thinking, which means perhaps he is not in his prep anymore and he has to now figure out things on the board against Magnus. e3. Magnus wants to get his bishop out. Viktor quickly castles. Now for white, he has the bishop pair but a slightly awkward development, while black has a pretty smooth development here. Also, Magnus has to decide whether he wants to get his bishop out, which he does, but now Viktor can snatch this pawn. Of course, it looks very dangerous to play this way. Let's say something like e4, threatening e5. It looks dangerous, but perhaps this might be the best way to play. But Viktor says, I'm just going to play in the center, and pushes his pawn to d5, which is a logical move. But on the other hand, you are letting Magnus get a very risk-free edge, which is actually more dangerous if you think about it against Magnus. And now c5 I think should be preferred, just so that you can get your pieces out freely. Yes, it also opens the position for the bishops, but he takes on c4, and I'm not a big fan of this move, because now the knight can take the pawn on c4. So knight takes c4 is the move. And queen to d5 played by Viktor, attacking here on g2, threatening a mate in 1. If Magnus is careless, that would be game over. So a very logical move now is to play his pawn to f3, blunting this battery here. And the idea next, if possible, is to go b4, bishop b2, and just stop these breakthroughs for black. Right now, if you play c5, I can take, queen takes, and play b4 with the idea of bishop b2. So for now, Viktor plays rook d8 with the idea of c5, you can see. And Magnus plays this beautiful prophylactic move, bishop e2. So that if c5, you can take, and you can't take back with the queen, as this is hanging and your queen is protected. He goes knight c6. And now e5 could be on the cards. But I love Magnus's next move, queen c2. And if you play e5 now, I can take, and play e4, followed by bishop coming to e3. So Viktor does not rush here. He brings his rook to c8. And now we have an important moment. What is Magnus going to do here? Bishop d2 is definitely possible, but he has to be careful about e5 move. He plays b3. I love this move. Why? Because after e5, de, knight e5, you can now play the move bishop b2, and white is doing quite well. So here Viktor plays the move b5, and Magnus goes back knight d2, knight b2, and he's a bit clumsy here. You can see his pieces are clumsily positioned, but he knows that he's doing well, and this e5 move is what Viktor has been banking upon. But Magnus now has a very strong idea, knight d3. Love it, because if e takes d4, there is e4, and then you have a great position here. So this is actually the reason why now Viktor had to push his pawn. But after pushing the pawn, the knight is actually jumping to c5, attacking the bishop and the pawn. This is amazing play by Magnus Carlsen here. e4 pawn, now threatening fe4, threatening knight b7. So Viktor now goes for a tactic. Wow! Knight takes d4, and Magnus instantly recaptures. He's calculated this all, of course. Because if queen takes d4, king h1, if you take here, you're going to lose on b7, 2 pieces for a rook. So his point was, now queen takes d4. I think Magnus must go king h1, and not to take the rook, but do something about this bishop. But already you can see how by stopping opponent's ideas, Magnus got him to make a mistake. He takes on f3. And here is another very important moment, because if you take with the bishop will escape, and then you can take the rook. And so you have to start with g takes f3. This is how you begin with here. Bishop a8, and now comes a very, very important move, which is, I mean, you can play bishop b2. I think bishop b2 is a good move. There's also rook a2. Bishop b2, maybe queen d2 is a slightly irritating move. So Magnus goes bishop g5. But Magnus has now saved his rook. He's a piece up. Opponent has couple of pawns, but I don't see how this is a big problem. He's attacked the bishop and the knight, but Magnus does have bishop takes f6 in the position. Yes, he chops it off, and now queen takes f6 has to be played. If g takes f6, the knight will simply escape and the pawn structure is ruined. So he takes on f6. You can see Viktor shaking his head very slightly. He knows that this is just completely over against a player like Magnus. Knight e4, attacking the queen. It's not just that black is a piece down, but his remaining pawns, like the 2 pawns that he has for compensation, are doing nothing much. So, but we should learn from Magnus how he finishes off such positions. I guess rook a d1 is a very natural and normal move, offering rooks for trade. But Magnus plays queen c1. He wants to trade the queens, and this is also a very cool move. Queen h4, attacking here. And maybe with the idea of rook h5, if someday it's feasible, but rook g1 is a very nice move. He's looking here, and rook h5 will be met with rook g2, stopping all threats. Rook e5 played, and here the point is maybe to take and take. So some care has to be taken by Magnus here. And I love this move, queen c3. This is such a good move, because now this sacrifice just doesn't work, as there's a mate on g7 here. So he plays rook e8, just defending his rook. And now Magnus snatches another pawn. This cannot be taken because of mate here. The rook is attacked, and this is all over now. There's nothing much to do. He goes rook 8 e7, but now after rook a d1 there is a back rank mate which is threatened, and Magnus finds it. Great move there. and I think Viktor Gazik is completely lost, because even if he removes the back rank threat, there's a check and you lose the bishop here. So this is a resignable position here. Magnus has played a great game, in fact a flawless game of chess here, and he is such a big asset to the Norwegian team because he's able to score 1 point almost every round. Then from the remaining 3 boards they need 1.5. Viktor resigns, Magnus scores a win, and this helped his